My girl, why did the good Lord play such a prank on you? Ivana hugged her daughter, who came running back from the street in tears again. The boy started throwing stones at her, shouting and insulting her. The girl cried uncontrollably, and Ivana couldn't say anything. They had only recently moved to this village when her husband kicked them out. Ivana and her daughter had to find a place to live. That's when Ivana remembered that her aunt had left her a small house in the village. She hadn't been there for a long time, but she hoped the house was still suitable for living. 3 years ago, Ivana was a very happy wife expecting a child. Her husband George practically worshipped her. They got married against all odds. Ivana grew up in an orphanage with nothing to her name. She didn't know where her parents were, but she remembered that when she was little, some scary old woman used to visit her in the orphanage. She was scary to everyone else, but when she looked at Ivana, there was a kind spark in her eyes. Ivana wasn't afraid of her at all. She didn't remember who she was, but she considered her a grandmother. Then the old lady disappeared when Ivana was almost grown up. She found out that the old lady hadn't disappeared on her own, but rather, they stopped letting her visit. They said she frightened people. Ivana understood that she probably wouldn't be able to find that old lady now, especially since she didn't even remember her face anymore. She met George 3 years later. By then, the girl had become acquainted with the hardships of life, so George was a breath of fresh air. He courted her so beautifully and then introduced her to his mother. Ivana was received coldly by the woman who, on the very first day upon learning that George wanted to marry a homeless girl, simply kicked her out of the house. Ivana ran for her life. She adamantly refused to see George, but he was persistent. She had an apartment, the state gave it to her as an orphan. So George spent nights there. Eventually, Ivana gave in. They quietly got married without any ceremony and started living there. They worked hard, and within a year, they sold her apartment, added some money, and bought a 2-room apartment. That's when his mother reappeared, but she had no intention of accepting Ivana. She came to their place as if it were her own, constantly telling the girl that if it weren't for George, she'd always be living in the gutter. At first, Ivana cried, but then she got used to it. She couldn't keep complaining to George all the time. He worked a lot, he was tired, he wanted warmth and comfort at home, not arguments and scandals. Another year passed. Ivana got pregnant. Oh, the drama that followed. His mother screamed that she didn't need such grandchildren. Who knows who the parents of this homeless girl were? Maybe drunks, murderers, or even worse. Why breed such offspring? Or do you think oranges can grow from an ash tree? No upbringing will help, genes will take their toll. There was no way to calm her down, so Ivana couldn't bear it anymore. For the first time in her life, she raised her voice at her mother-in-law. No one is forcing you to spend time with your grandchildren. No one is inviting you here. You'd be much happier if you quietly stayed at home. Apparently, Ivana's glare made her mother-in-law prefer to stay silent and leave quickly. And that evening, Ivana and George argued for the first time. Ivana, what do you think you're doing? Mom said you wanted to kill her. Ivana hadn't thought he was serious, so she casually replied, well, I didn't kill her. Don't you dare. Do you hear me? Don't even raise your voice at my mother. George jumped up and grabbed her hand. George, have you lost your mind? So she can come at any time, insult me and my child, and I can't respond? George let go of her hand. I've said my piece. That's when Ivana felt deeply hurt and regretted selling her apartment. But there was no turning back, so they had to figure out how to live, especially since the baby would be arriving soon. They didn't speak for a week, and then George was the first to apologize. Ivana, please forgive me. She's my mother. It's not for me to tell her off, and I can't change her, so please just try to ignore her. Ivana was very relieved that they finally made up, so she said, I'll do my best. Life went on fairly smoothly. His mother-in-law only came when George was home, and in his presence, she refrained from her usual antics. Ivana also didn't pick fights, although she never really had before either. The time for childbirth arrived. They had prepared everything they needed, despite the mother-in-law's complaints about not buying anything in advance. But they were young. Ivana wondered if maybe this was the cause of all her troubles, hers and her daughter's, or was it something else? After all, there were many reasons, really, the constant animosity from her mother-in-law, which Ivana felt almost physically, and unknown genes. Anyway, regardless of the reasons, her daughter Megan was born with a large birthmark, almost covering her entire face. When George saw the girl, he paled. "What's this?" "It's a birthmark." "But how? She's going to grow up looking like a monster." "George, how can you say that? She's your daughter." Ever since Ivana returned from the maternity ward, it was as if a black cat had crossed their path. George didn't approach the baby at all, and the mother-in-law added fuel to the fire. I told you that some sort of monster would be born." "There you go, George. Where were your brains? Why do you never listen to your mother?" Ivana gritted her teeth, but remained silent. She knew that this wouldn't just end, something unpleasant awaited her ahead. So she had money, she would save here, receive compensation for childbirth there, and wouldn't tell anyone. They collected a decent sum for a gift at work, and Ivana hid that too. She hoped to save a lot of money and go to the capital. She thought they could remove such birthmarks there, piece by piece. But could they? The main thing was to endure and save up as much as possible. But fate had other plans. George was supposed to get a promotion. He was nervous, waited for a long time, and Ivana reassured him. "George, you're smart, always held in high regard. Everything will work out for sure." And it did. George got promoted, and he celebrated in a restaurant, and of course, without Ivana. She had nowhere to leave the child, and the mother-in-law wouldn't stay with her for anything. Plus, Ivana didn't trust her, she'd rather stay home herself. George was supposed to return at 8 o'clock, and Ivana got Megan ready. She went out to the yard to wait for her husband. She pushed the stroller for a long time, but her husband didn't appear. And finally, when Ivana was about to go home, a taxi pulled into the yard. A drunken husband jumped out of the taxi with some girl. "Oh, Ivana, meet my new employee, the secretary." Can you imagine? "I have my own secretary now." "Congratulations." Ivana wasn't as joyful as George. She knew that her husband behaving like this wasn't good. "And let's go to us, continue celebrating, George." "But you know there's a little child there, Ivana. Are you not happy for your husband, George?" "Of course, I am happy." The woman flinched and went into the house, the drunken company following. Ivana endured as much as she could. Megan didn't want to sleep because there was so much noise in the kitchen. Finally, she couldn't stand it and went to them. "Could you please be a little quieter? The baby can't sleep." "The baby? Oh, what baby?" "A freak who has no place on this earth." His companion looked at him with surprise. "Boss, what are you talking about?" She hiccuped and laughed. "All right, let me show you. The queen gave birth last night to either a son or a daughter." He pushed Ivana aside and dragged the girl into the room where Megan was crying. Ivana tried not to let them in, but George rudely pushed her away. When the girl saw Megan, she screamed. "George, how could such a handsome man like you have such a freak for a child?" Ivana sat in the room. They partied in the kitchen for another hour. Then the door slammed. Apparently, George's companion had left. And then snoring came from the room. At night, Ivana packed a bag just in case, and she wasn't wrong. George woke up with a headache. "Ivana, where's breakfast? Why don't you ask your new acquaintance to make breakfast? You know, the one who screamed that our child is a freak." He stood there for a moment. "And what, Megan isn't a freak? Why get offended by the truth? You've lost all humanity you had, do you realize that? This is your child." "Well, that's still a question." In my family, there were no freaks, but what was in yours? That's a big question. Mom was right. You should have thought, George. Don't you dare insult me and my daughter. And why not? You know what? He turned to her. Evina, you should roll out of here with your freak. It's embarrassing in front of people, living like in a zoo with monsters. Evina started crying. Where will we go? Well, that's your problem now. If you haven't forgotten, this apartment was mostly purchased with my money. George swung and slapped Evina. I give you 5 minutes to gather your stuff. Evina quickly dressed Megan, grabbed her bag, and headed for the exit, but George grabbed her hand. If you dare to show up and try to claim the apartment from me, just know there will be one less freak in the world. Evina rushed out of the apartment, and in the yard, she stopped. What now? Where to go? That's when she remembered about home. It's a good thing she didn't tell George about it, otherwise, she would have had to sell it too. So here they were, she and Megan. At first, while Megan was very small, nobody knew anything. They walked in the yard, practically not going anywhere. But then Evina realized that she needed to work. So she told the neighbor that she worked as a seamstress in the city. People in the village were a bit kinder than in the city. They pitied Evina more, in their own way. They asked, maybe you should give the child away and then get married, give birth to a normal one? But Evina just clenched her lips. Gradually, people got used to it. But children didn't. At school, Megan was simply called names, and if she went out for a walk, it was just a quiet horror. Megan was a very smart girl. By the age of 7, when it was time to go to school, she could read, draw, and write excellently. She even learned to count by herself. While her mother was sewing dresses for village girls, Megan was arranging sticks on the floor. She would arrange them and then count. She rarely went out for walks, and everything was fine as long as the scariest bully, Glenn, didn't appear outside. He was 3 years older than Megan, but that didn't stop him from bothering her and even hitting her. And today, Megan ran in. There was a bruise on her forehead and a scrape on her shoulder. Mom, why am I like this? Why doesn't anyone love me, and why does everyone hate me? Sweetheart, it's not because you're bad, it's because people are mean. You have to learn to accept them as they are. But I don't do anything bad. I never hurt anyone. Her daughter cried on her lap, and Evina didn't know what to say. Of course, she tried to save money. But when she learned the prices for removing birthmarks at that clinic, she immediately realized that if she collected the necessary amount, it would only be in her old age. She stroked her daughter's hair, and Megan couldn't calm down. Then she fell silent, and Evina realized that her daughter fell asleep in her arms. They decided she'd nap a little, let Megan doze off and calm down. Evina sat, pondered, and remembered a long time ago when she was still lying in the maternity ward. An old nurse approached her. Evina cried over Megan, and she touched Evina's hand and sat down next to her. Well, why are you crying? You should be happy. Look at what a lovely girl you have. Are you joking? She'll suffer her whole life now. But it's unnecessary. God put this mark on her so she wouldn't forget and make your girl the happiest. You're saying the same thing. So what? They used to say that if there's such a big birthmark, then it's God's person. You'll see, your daughter will be your happiest, and you'll get a piece of happiness from her. That would be nice. And don't fret so much. Tears won't help the milk, and you're just unnecessarily worrying. Evina now remembered the nurse. Why isn't the prediction coming true? She mentally addressed this nurse. There was a loud knock on the door. Evina jumped. Megan immediately woke up and looked at her mother. Villagers didn't knock like that. They usually knocked quietly and came in right away. Who's there? Come in. The door opened, and a strange woman appeared on the threshold. She was a tall old woman wearing some kind of loose cloak. It was as wide as in old movies, and because it constantly moved, it created the impression that the old woman was in rags. The woman bowed slightly. Greetings, hosts. Would you shelter a traveler? The old woman was very scary, but when she looked at Megan, she smiled kindly. "Don't be afraid of me. I just got lost a bit, looking for a village." "Ah, so this is it. Come in, don't stand there. I'll make you a cup of hot tea right away." "Thank you, kind woman." She rummaged somewhere in the vast cloak and pulled out a large chocolate bar. It was clear that the chocolate was fresh, not crumpled or worn. "Here, granddaughter, probably tasty." That's what the vendor told me. "Thank you." Megan took the chocolate, then couldn't resist asking, "Why are you looking at me so calmly?" The old lady was surprised. "Why shouldn't I look at you calmly? You're not some kind of wolf." "Well, everyone looks at me differently." "Well, dear, if they're fools, let them look. You're smart, why pay attention to them?" Megan smiled. No one besides her mom talks to her so normally. Ivana brought the cups, then put a bowl of cookies on the table and suddenly asked, "Maybe you'd like to eat? I made a very good borscht today." The old woman looked at her attentively, then said, "Why not? I've been through a lot." They had a cheerful dinner. Then Megan went to bed, and Ivana decided to ask the old woman who she was and where she came from. She didn't look like a homeless person, rather, like some fairy tale character. "You said you were looking for this village, yes?" "Once, my sister lived here. The cursed one. Thought maybe she's still alive." "And why are you like this about her?" Ivana was terribly interested. She herself didn't know why. "This sister of mine ruined her own life, and mine, and my daughter's, basically everyone's. The story is long, but if you want, I'll tell you." "Very much. But if it's not too much trouble for you, maybe it's some family secret." It was a secret, but not anymore. Now I would give a lot to shake up that secret and understand. But where do I start? Okay, listen. Once upon a time, 2 girls were born. Not at the same time, but with a 5-year gap. For some reason, Mom and Dad really loved the older one and didn't love the younger one at all. The older one was exactly my sister. She grew up like a princess. If the younger one was dragged to the fields from the age of 6, then Molly's little hands hurt, her little legs hurt, and so on. And me? I saw how they treated me, so I kept quiet. I only hoped for one thing: when I grow up, I'll meet a guy who will take me away from this family. I was 17 when my parents died, and Molly was already over 20. By those times, she was considered an old maid. Her mother offered her so many suitors. She had a strong farm. Any guy would be happy to marry into such a farm. But Molly just turned up her nose. Either the suitor's nose was like a potato or something else. So her mother never saw her favorite daughter get married. She died and threatened with her finger to watch over Molly. But I wasn't interested in following her, and I immediately said that the times of maids were over. So everyone is on their own. Oh, how she yelled at me, oh, how she cursed. It's embarrassing to admit she couldn't even cook soup, she didn't know how. And a year later, a guy proposed to me. His name was Stan. Handsome, rich, charming, I fell in love, and so did he. Oh, Molly was furious. Then it turns out he liked her too, so much so that she seriously aimed to marry him. She cursed like never before. But Stan and I just laughed it off, and we shouldn't have. We should have taken these threats more seriously. Anyway, Molly went to a witch, grandmother. There were such people back then. She gave her a love potion, and Stan drank it. I didn't know any of this at first. I see Stan changing before my eyes, becoming rude, arrogant. 3 days before the wedding, he caught me in the barn and did his dark deed, and Molly saw it. She laughed, promised to tell the whole village. I had no choice but to flee to the city to avoid shame. And in the city, I realized I was pregnant. When it was time to give birth, I went to the village to talk to Stan. Something had to be done. After all, the child was his. But he met me coldly. He said that he had married Molly 2 months ago, that he was happy, and I meant nothing to him. I cried. I asked what to do now. But then, my sister came out onto the porch, a gun in hand. She shot at my feet, and a stone flew off, hitting me in the face. I covered my face with my hands, but you shouldn't do that when pregnant. So I left for the city with nothing. A week later, I gave birth to a beautiful girl, just with a slight defect. Oh, thank you to that woman who took me in when I first arrived. She warmed me, gave me work opportunities. She was like a mother to me. When she died, I cried a lot. I didn't even miss my own mother like that. Anyway, Brittany and I lived without bothering anyone. I worked, met a good man. Brittany was 18 then, and he proposed to me. And I wasn't too old then, so we had a son. And then tragedy struck. I don't even know how it all happened. Molly came to us, battered and bruised. She begged me to take Stan. He's crazy about you. He wants you and your daughter to live with him. Him? I laughed then. Are you crazy, Molly? I'm married. My daughter is already grown. She's about to get married herself. I already have a son. But she looked at me strangely. How can you not take him? Aren't you sorry for your sister? Why should I pity you? Did you ever pity me? You're wrong, so wrong. You'll all regret it. And she left. But I didn't know it would all turn out like this. Brittany got married. She had a daughter, and on the very first day they went out for a walk with her husband, someone attacked them. Long story short, they died, and the baby was kidnapped. I almost went mad then. Or maybe I did. I forgot everything, my husband, my son. I walked the streets for hours, calling for my granddaughter, calling for my daughter. No one responded to me. I spent 3 times in a psychiatric clinic, but they always released me because, besides terrible grief, I didn't have any illness. So, I wandered around. One day, I met Molly. She looked at me with satisfaction. So, sister, suffering. You deserve it. You'll suffer all your life. And she left. And I realized that she stole my granddaughter. She took my daughter's life. I didn't recognize myself. When I came to my senses, everyone turned away from me. By the end of the term, it seemed like things were thawing out. Stan wasn't arrested. It turns out he didn't know what Molly did. He came to me, kneeling, begging for forgiveness. But what good is his forgiveness to me? You can't bring back my girls. And Molly couldn't say anything because, after my blow, she lost her memory. She was declared disabled. Once, walking around the city, I saw a girl behind the fence of an orphanage. She looked so much like my Alia, only without the defect. I couldn't resist and visited her several times. But then, as soon as the director found out that I had been in prison, they banned me from coming. I tried so many times, but all in vain. And then, my son got into business. He took me out of our hometown. Just a month ago, I came back. I thought I'd find out something, at least. Which house did your sister live in? Well, that's the thing. I don't know. And she moved to the village after everything, when she was 50. I didn't believe that she lost her memory and would incriminate herself. But I lived far away. I found out that she lived in this area and decided to try to find out something. Wait, my aunt found me in the orphanage when I was 15. She didn't know or didn't want to tell anything. She just said that my parents died. We didn't communicate with her at all. She was strange. I remember an album somewhere. Ivana rushed out of the room. Now she was sure that this old woman and the old woman who visited her were one and the same person. But how many years ago was that? She was already an old woman back then. Ivana returned with the album. Here, you can take a look. I haven't looked at it myself. Somehow, didn't have the time, she said cautiously, opening the album. Well, hello there, Molly, you cursed devil, Ivana froze. She didn't stand. Was this her grandmother standing before her? You're the one who came to the orphanage for me. As soon as I walked in, I knew I came to the right place. Why, look, here's a photo of her with Brittany, your mother. Ivana circled the table and screamed. A 10-year-old girl was looking at her with a huge birthmark on her face. When I saw Megan, I wanted to rush to you immediately. But I was afraid of scaring her. You can't rush things. So, I decided to tell you everything. Forgive us all, Evina, for your difficult life. Forgive Megan. We will all be together now. Everything will be fine. I just don't understand how you ended up here in the village. If you say you didn't communicate with your aunt, it's a simple story. I got married. His mother was against it, called me said I had bad genes, that I shouldn't have children. And when Megan was born with this birthmark, it started. They insulted her in every possible way, they called her names. I sold my apartment to buy us a bigger place, but he threw us out onto the street. So, we had to come here with Megan, otherwise, we had nowhere to go. I was so grateful to my aunt for this house. Oh, through bring out a wife and child onto the street, we'll show everyone what justice should be. Evina looked at the old woman. Though she was so full of energy that calling her old was a stretch. Tell me, what's your name? So, you're my grandmother and Megan's great-grandmother. My name is Judith. I've talked too much. Could you show me somewhere to sleep? We'll talk in the morning. You know, I would be very pleased if you just called me Grandma. Evina stood up and the woman did too. Evina didn't understand how she ended up in her arms, but she hugged her and burst into tears. It turns out it's so nice to realize that you're not alone in the world. You have a grandmother, even if she's old somewhere out there. You have an uncle, who theoretically was only a little older than Evina herself. The woman stepped away from her and wiped her eyes. Okay, don't lose heart. I need to make a call, and when she pulled out a phone from her pocket, one of the latest models, Evina lost her ability to speak altogether. Judith went outside and Evina started to make the couch. The night was restless. Evina kept thinking, going over things in her mind. She couldn't fall asleep, although Megan was sleeping peacefully beside her. Judith wasn't either. Evina thought she was just tired from the journey. She decided to get up early to make pancakes for breakfast. She dozed off towards morning. She woke up to the sound of someone talking in the kitchen. Megan wasn't there. Evina jumped up, flew out of the room. Megan was sitting at the table, eating omelet, and Judith was sitting next to her. She wasn't wearing a headscarf, just a regular dress. Well, maybe not entirely regular. Evina, being a dressmaker, knew a thing or two about clothes, and this dress was very expensive. Are you awake, darling? Sorry, I didn't sleep all night. Felt like I was knocked out towards morning. What's there to apologize for, Evina? Stop apologizing for everything. This is your life, live it. Remember that. Okay, have you had breakfast? I can make something. We've had breakfast, we made it for you. Sit down, don't rush. I'll make tea for you. Yes, I'll do it myself, sit down. You'll have time to do it yourself. They hadn't finished breakfast yet when Judith's phone rang. Yes, Simon. The third house? Yes, I'll come out now. Well, Evina, get ready to meet your relatives. How? Evelina's eyes widened in fear, and Megan immediately hugged her. Oh, come on, as if it's something terrible. Relatives, my brother and his wife and their son. My. Why are you all so scared? Judith shook her head while Evina and Megan rushed to the window. A huge Jeep pulled up to the house, and a man who appeared to be in his 40s immediately jumped out, followed by a 12-year-old boy and a strikingly beautiful woman. She was heavenly beautiful, very tanned. They each hugged their grandmother in turn and started unloading bags. Evina decided it wouldn't be polite to hide in the house. Well, Megan, shall we go greet the relatives? Let's go, Mom. Do you think they won't be scared of me? I don't think so. They went out onto the porch, holding hands tightly. The man turned around and glanced at Evina, then Megan, and smiled widely. Well, come on, let me hug you. He dropped the bags on the ground and rushed towards them. Evina took a few steps and found herself in strong arms, and not knowing why, suddenly burst into tears. The man picked Megan up. "Why is our mom crying, Evina?" "No tears, everything will be fine now," but Evina couldn't stop. Then Simon's wife and grandmother approached them. All the women burst into tears watching them, and Megan started wailing. The man looked around in bewilderment at everyone, then turned to his son. "What should we do?" And he shrugged. "Women, let them cry it out." Evina found his words so amusing that she even burst out laughing, albeit through tears. 5 minutes later, they were all laughing, and Simon scratched his head. "I've always been amazed by this female ability. Just now, they were crying, and now they're laughing." Well. An hour later, everyone was sitting at the table. Simon's wife's name was Lizzie, and their son's name was Jack. Jack and Megan were bored sitting at the table, listening to the adults' conversation. They played with the tablet for a bit, then Jack continued, "Megan, shall we go for a walk? You'll show me around here." "No, let's not go. Glenn will start calling names again and throwing stones." "Is that so?" "Yeah, they think I'm ugly and throw stones at me." "Then we definitely should go." "You don't have to be afraid with me." Jack firmly took Megan's hand. "We'll go for a walk." Simon turned to them. "Just for a little while, okay? Dad." They had almost reached the end of the village when Glenn appeared. "Oh, here comes the ugly one." Glenn was accompanied by other kids. They smirked. Glenn was the strongest. No one could defeat him. That's why everyone sided with him. Who wants to go against Glenn? Jack freed his hand and approached Glenn. "Come on, apologize." "What for? Where did you come from to defend the ugly one?" Megan stood frozen. She thought if she ran for help, they would beat Jack before she could help him. So she decided to stay and help her brother. And there was a heated debate between her brother and Glenn. They agreed that whoever won would be right. Glenn found himself on the ground time and time again. He couldn't understand himself why he couldn't stand on his feet against Jack. The boys who had been laughing at first were now openly laughing. "Enough already," Glenn pleaded, finding himself in the dust once again. He got up, approached Megan. "Sorry, I won't do it again." Then he turned to Jack. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "In the gym." "City 1, right?" "Yeah, from the city," Glenn whistled. "Why are you defending her?" "She's my sister." "Yeah, right, exactly." The whole gang escorted them to Evelina's house. When Evelina saw the whole group through the window, her heart sank. Oh, they must have been beaten again. I shouldn't have let them go. She rushed out onto the street, followed by Simon. "Megan, Jack, are you okay?" Evelina rushed to them, feeling them over, but the children looked fine. She couldn't understand how this could be. Then Glenn emerged from the crowd. "Aunt Evelina, please forgive us. We won't do it anymore." Simon chuckled, "And we won't need you to. We're leaving for the capital tomorrow." Sometimes Evelina didn't understand what was happening around her. They left, and honestly, she didn't regret a single moment leaving this hateful village. Leslie immediately took them shopping upon their arrival. Evelina felt like they were buying everything in sight. In the evening, Simon said, "Tomorrow is a very important day. Meg has an appointment at the clinic in the morning, and in the evening, my lawyer friend will help you get your apartment back. Maybe you don't need it now, but the person who threw my niece and her child out should be punished." When Evelina heard the name of the clinic, she was speechless. "I don't have that kind of money. I'm saving up, of course, but the prices there are so high that I'll never be able to afford it. Although if I can take part of the apartment back from George in cash, that's something. You know, Evelina, when I looked at my beloved Aunt Olga, you know what I thought?" Simon looked at Evelina and smiled. "No, I thought that when I grew up, I would become a doctor who would rid people of imperfections like moles, warts, scars, and I did. Honestly, I turned out to be an ordinary doctor but a good businessman. This is my clinic, and no one will ever take money from you there." And once again, Evelina burst into tears and couldn't stop. Leslie hugged her. Why do you keep crying all the time? This is good news. Everything is fine. And you cry, Megan? Lucas arrived at the courthouse. As soon as she got out, George rushed towards her. What are you doing here? Want some shame? I'll give it to you. Behind him, his mother was bustling. Just look at you, George, all dressed up. Where did you get the money from? Earned it, probably in some notorious place. Evelina tried not to look at them. She felt out of place. 3 hours later, she walked out of the courthouse as the owner of the apartment and with a hefty sum of money awarded to her. The judge unequivocally sided with her, and George had to blush with embarrassment from the questions. Evelina smiled, and Lucas admired her. She was such a wonderful woman, but life hadn't been kind to her. Evelina picked up the phone. Sorry, I need to make a call. My daughter has surgery today. Meg picked up the phone herself. Mom, everything's fine. I'm not in pain and not scared, honestly. 3 years later, she finally had to appear at the house where she lived. She decided to sell it for any amount, even for the smallest one. She didn't want this house to remain in her life. She felt like it was the last thread connecting them to their family and misfortune. Lucas, her husband, grumbled, Well, you should have told me. I would have sent someone. We would have burned this house to the ground and never thought about it again. Lucas behaved like a civilized person. Meg was the first to jump out of the car. Mom, look, there's my ball lying over there, completely deflated. Meg walked around her yard. She had long forgotten about resentments. She didn't have time for them now. She was diligently studying English, planning to go to college in England in the future. That's where her brother studied, and Meg couldn't bear to be without him for a minute. Megan, is that you? Glenn stood by the gate, looking somewhat scared. It's me, Megan smiled, and Glenn suddenly felt embarrassed. Where's that, her? She's not here anymore. You didn't like her, remember? Why do you ask? Glenn was completely flustered and didn't know what to say. Then Megan took pity on him. Want to go for a walk? It's been a while. What interesting things do you have around here? Glenn eagerly nodded, thought for a moment, and even offered his elbow for Megan to take his hand. Lucas raised an eyebrow and smiled. That's it, 1, 2, and the opponent is defeated, all in the mother. Evelina looked at him in surprise. I'll keep quiet. Where should I put the bags? Glenn tried to take shorter steps to make it easier for Megan to walk. He talked about this and that. Megan remembered some people, forgot others, but she found everything interesting. Why did you come here? Mom decided to sell the house so we'll never have to come here again, never. That's a shame. Well, yeah, and you've changed a lot. And am I not an ugly duckling anymore? Megan stopped. How could you think that? You're beautiful. Glenn sighed with regret. Glenn, give me your number. I promise I'll call you often. Really? He was so happy that Megan felt a bit awkward. Yes, Glenn, really. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.